what I would what I would be talking about is really the content of a book that I have just written, which came out a few months ago, couple of months ago, in India. An earlier edition had come out from Columbia University Press. Now, the basic point is that any political praxis, whether that political praxis involves working for a social revolution or whether that political praxis involves working to get the state not to interfere in the freedom of businessmen to do business as they like, whatever is the political praxis, is something which is informed by a certain political philosophy. And every political philosophy is based on a reading of the world, a certain reading of the world, which certainly in today's context, in which economics plays a very important role. Therefore, in a sense, you can say that economics informs political philosophy, and political philosophy in turn underlies whatever political praxis that people are pursuing. Now, liberalism is a political philosophy that is basically concerned with individual freedom. Its focus is on individual freedom. But liberalism as a political philosophy also believes that fundamentally individual freedom is not just compatible with capitalism, but is best served by the capitalist mode of production. In other words, capitalism involves uh, a kind of freedom to do business, freedom to, pursue whatever you wish to do. And that is something which is really a part of individual freedom. While, on the contrary, socialism implies a kind of direction, which it implies a kind of authoritarianism in which people are directed to do certain things, and therefore socialism is fundamentally inimical to individual freedom. The general belief in liberal circles is that while socialism may be good for in terms of egalitarianism, in terms of having greater equality, it is something which is really destructive of individual freedom. Many people even talk about there being a certain contradiction between equality on the one side and freedom on the other side. By freedom, I mean individual freedom. Now, I think this is based on a certain conception of capitalism and therefore a certain conception of political economy. What I try in the book is to really make that conception clearer. In other words, to kind of, illuminate that particular conception. That conception basically believes that capitalism is a system in which individuals participate of their own volition. That basically large numbers of individual economic agents come together to form the capitalist system. Now, this is something which is common no matter which strand of economics you take, whether you take neoclassical economics or whether you take classical political economy. There are major differences between them in the details of their theories, but on the other hand, they all believe that, as a matter of fact, capitalism came into being because of individuals willing to bring it into existence. And what is more, capitalism is always associated with individual agency. Individuals come together and form this arrangement, operate within this arrangement, and in the process, they actually not only better their own conditions, and better is interpreted here in the sense of becoming Pareto-wise better off, namely that you become better off and nobody else becomes worse off. that therefore society reaches a Pareto optimum, society reaches an optimum state of being where you cannot make anyone else better off without making someone else worse off. Okay? Therefore, the individuals who come together to form the capitalist system not only act in a way that really is in their own interest, but in the process, they also serve a social interest. If you have substantial mass unemployment, in that case, nobody would like to become a worker voluntarily, because becoming a worker voluntarily opens up the probability of remaining unemployed and therefore remaining poor. So the point is that the Smithian idea that people generally through individual agency became capitalists, some the thrifty ones became capitalists, the non-thrifty ones became workers, and the workers were better off than they were earlier, is a proposition that collapses if it is the case that those who become workers, some of them remain unemployed. Now, if some of them remain unemployed, then naturally nobody would like to remain unemployed. And so it cannot be that actually they voluntarily came into this arrangement called capitalism. So the Keynesian revolution had actually dealt a very severe blow to the structure of traditional economics, which, by the way, is why I don't know how many of you are students of economics, but which, by the way, is why there is so much opposition to Keynes within traditional economics. I'll tell you a story that once we had somebody coming from the London School of Economics to the economics department of my center, to my center in JNU, and wanting to do a PhD with us. So we were very surprised. We said, how come you're coming from London School of Economics to do PhD with us? Normally it's the other way around. So then he said, no, I wanted to work on Keynes. And I was told that my supervisor, that these days in LSE or elsewhere in England, they don't do Keynes. So if you have to do Keynes, his supervisor had heard that in JNU there is a center where they do Keynes. So you can imagine, Keynes has become so kind of, unwelcome to the economics tradition. And that is why then enormous effort is made to show that the Keynesian result arises because of the fixity of money wages. Those of you who are students of economics would have known that basically the entire argument is that if you genuinely had flexibility of money wages, then there would be no involuntary unemployment. Now, that's not correct at all. In fact, Keynesian result arises, as indeed Marx is earlier, because money is considered a form in which wealth can be held. Now that is something which is obvious. If money is a medium of circulation, suppose I sell something, get money, and then I buy something, then the standard assumption, if money is to function only as a medium of circulation, is that between my sale and my purchase, there must be only a fixed time interval. In other words, like an automaton, if I go and sell something today, then within, let us say, a certain period, like an automaton, I must go and buy something. Only then is money functioning only as a medium of circulation. But if it is the case that I decide to postpone my buying beyond that period, in that case I'm holding on to money as wealth. So obviously the argument that money is only a medium of circulation but not a form in which wealth can be held is an argument which really lacks validity. And suppose money is held as a form of wealth, and suppose it is the case that there is money, suppose there is involuntary unemployment, money wages fall, prices fall, and money wages and prices fall because people are not buying enough, because they are holding on to money. in that case, the fall in prices would mean that people might expect a further fall in prices, hold on to more money, because then tomorrow you may be able to have more goods with that money. Therefore, once you allow money to be a form of wealth holding, then involuntary unemployment follows. It is not the fixity of money wages that gives rise to involuntary unemployment, because even a flexible wage price world would actually have involuntary unemployment if money is allowed to be a form in which wealth is held. Therefore, in a very peculiar sense, the rationality attributed to the individuals was at the same time denied to the individual the rationality when it comes to asset preference. That, the individual is rational in all kinds of things, maximizing this and that, but the individual does not maximize any kind of benefit from holding his wealth in diversified forms which include money. So it was a rationality that was necessarily bounded, that was necessarily denying the fact that it operates in other spheres. But as I said, this Keynes highlighted this particular aspect. But on the other hand, Keynes himself did not go far enough. He had an eclectic position in which he thought that, okay, this is a problem as far as capitalism is concerned. As all of you know, he was completely anti-communist, so he actually he was terrified that the Bolshevik revolution might actually happen in countries like Britain and other advanced capitalist countries. And therefore he thought that if the kind of mass unemployment that capitalism generates persists, remember he was writing in the 1930s in the midst of the Great Depression, so if that kind of unemployment persists, then the Bolshevik Revolution would happen in countries like Britain. So to forestall that possibility, he argued that capitalism must rectify itself so that such unemployment does not happen. Okay, and so his entire idea was to rectify capitalism in a way that it actually functions more like the traditional theory had believed, but he faulted the traditional theory on the grounds that this does not happen automatically. Okay, he wanted what he called socialization of investment, that the state must intervene in order to bring about a level of investment that actually produces full employment, that generates enough demand for the full employment output. Okay. But Keynes did not go far enough because of the fact that he thought that with state intervention you would be able to rectify the problems of capitalism. What this missed is something which the other way of looking at capitalism actually highlights. That other way of looking at capitalism is actually Marx's way of looking at capitalism, though what I'm going to suggest is not necessarily the standard interpretation of Marx. I mean, it's a very specific reading of Marx. Now, that way says that, look, every individual under capitalism is acting not according to his or her own volition, but it is acting, being compelled to act in particular ways. If it is the case that you don't act in the way that the system compels you to act, in that case, you would be unemployed. You'd fall by the wayside. Okay. The capitalists accumulate not because they like accumulating, but they accumulate because they are coerced into accumulating. If you don't accumulate and the other fellow does, then the other fellow would become bigger, would become more efficient, and would eventually outcompete you. So everybody is alienated under capitalism, including the capitalists. That nobody really acts in a way which is of your own volition. Now, this is something which actually fits in. I mean, okay, I'm not saying that that this is identical with, but it fits in with with the notion of a productive system. You see, the earlier economics that I was talking about is one which really, in a sense, generalizes from an exchange economy. In an exchange economy, you actually have, there is individual agency. I have some goods, someone else has some goods, and then I go and exchange my goods for someone else's goods. But on the other hand, a production economy is quite different when you're analyzing production, because production has to be coordinated. If it is the case, many of you would have seen Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times. There's a conveyor belt. When the thing comes to you, if you decide to go for a walk, in that case, production stops. So the point is that there has to be a discipline in the system of production. Feudalism imposes this discipline by using the whip, basically through coercion. As, of course, slavery, of course, is based on coercion, but feudalism kind of enforces this discipline. So you cannot have production without discipline. That discipline in earlier modes of production, like feudalism and so on, is based on coercion. Under capitalism, there is no direct coercion. But if there is no direct coercion, that discipline is exercised by indirect coercion, that is enforced through having a reserve army of labor, having a number of unemployed people. If there are a number of unemployed people, and suppose when in the production, in the conveyor belt, input comes to me and I decide to go for a walk, then they're going to sack me. And therefore I join that army of unemployed people. So the point is that having a reserve army of labor is an essential condition for production to occur under capitalism. Okay. It is an essential condition also for price stability and so on, but I wouldn't go into that now. So the point is that this reserve army of labor compels workers to work in a particular way by imposing a discipline on them. It compels capitalists to accumulate, because that capitalist who does not accumulate, does not introduce technological progress, is going to eventually fall by the wayside and therefore be forced to join the reserve army of labor. Therefore, the system forces everybody to act in particular ways, and if you don't, then you fall outside of the system. And there is an outside, and that outside is the reserve army of labor. If there was no outside, if there was full employment of all resources like traditional economics believes, in that case there would be no possibility of production, because the kind of discipline, the kind of coordination that is required for production cannot be enforced on any of the workers, any of the producers. So if this is the case, in that case, what then, how the capitalist system develops is one which is based upon certain spontaneous tendencies. It's a spontaneous system. By spontaneous, I mean it's a system in which the outcome is not visualized by anybody. Okay. Unlike traditional economics that says the overall working of the system is something that conforms to my wishes, the outcome is not visualized by anybody. As a matter of fact, as I mentioned, if you have unemployment, in that case, the very notion of rationality goes, because rationality presupposes that between my intentions to act in a certain way and the outcome, there must be a correspondence. But if I intend to act in a certain way and the outcome is something completely different, in that case there is no basis for me to act rationally. Okay? And obviously it is not only destructive of social rationality, because obviously unemployment cannot be Pareto optimal, but it is also destructive of any notion of individual rationality. No person can actually act rationally if the outcome that you have and the intentions with which you act completely diverge, have no relation between them. So, involuntary unemployment of the Keynesian kind is destructive of rationality, is destructive of the very basis on which, let us say, traditional economics is based. But as I was saying, that that if therefore the alternative way of looking at the system is that individuals do not come together of their own volition, but in fact individuals are forced to come together. They are forced to come together, Marx said, through a process of primitive accumulation of capital in which petty producers, peasants, are dispossessed of their land and then are made to become laborers. Some of them get employment as laborers, others become part of the reserve army of labor, which is why becoming employed is not guaranteed if the land is taken away from you, and which is why the land being taken away from you cannot be a voluntary act on your voluntary act of surrender on your part. So the alternative is one that actually sees capitalism as a system in which a whole lot of people are coerced impersonally into acting out certain roles which are imposed upon them by the system, and it is actually productive of a whole lot of tendencies. For instance, Marx talked about the tendency towards centralization of capital, because obviously everybody is coerced into accumulating so that they are not pushed out of the system, but everybody doesn't succeed in remaining in the system. Some are more successful than others, and therefore they push the others out, not necessarily as an act of voluntary kind of thing, but that is the way the system works. So you have over time fewer and fewer units of capital remaining, and that's what Marx calls centralization of capital. Or in common parlance, we refer to the concentration of capital, referring to that particular phenomenon. You can talk in terms of the fact that capitalism commoditizes everything. Everything over time becomes a commodity. Again, not because somebody wants it to become, but that is the way that the system compels. It is part of the immanent tendency of the system to commoditize everything. Okay. Similarly, you can talk in terms of there being no empty spaces, that the system tends to spread out everywhere. It's not as if, I mean, you can actually think of pre-capitalist societies in which some part remains unchanged, unaffected, while other part is is affected. Tribal life continues alongside a feudal system, continued for centuries alongside a feudal system. But under capitalism, no such possibility, because it actually, encroaches into the tribal society itself, integrates it into its own kind of corpus. So, you can think in terms of a number of immanent tendencies, but the upshot is that that since everybody, far from the vision which political philosophy of liberalism has of capitalism being an aggregation of individual agency, you actually have no individual agency. You actually have what appears to be individual agency being forced upon the individuals. They are made to act in particular ways. Therefore, individual freedom is contrary to what liberal political philosophy says. Individual freedom is incompatible with capitalism. And this is not just the freedom of the workers. So far I have not talked about exploitation, I have not talked about the expropriations of surplus value and so on, but simply even the capitalists, that a perception of capitalism where individuals are coerced to participate in this system. Nobody has the will to kind of opt out of it, because if so, then you'd fall by the wayside, you'd become part of the reserve army of labor, and therefore you act out your roles, and out of these actions emerge certain immanent tendencies of the system that nobody particularly willed or planned or even visualized. Okay. Now the state is not something which is outside of it. There's a very peculiar dichotomy that you find in Keynes. Keynes, by the way, was a liberal, but he called his political philosophy new liberalism. New liberalism implying that individual freedom is achieved not by the state keeping its hands off the system, but by the state intervening in the system. So he actually said that the earlier philosophy of liberalism had erred in believing that the state remaining outside of the system, which is what Adam Smith was demanding, laissez-faire, that the laissez-faire system, which was the core of earlier liberalism, is something which has to be changed, and you have to have state intervention. So Keynes, who was still a liberal, actually called his kind of outlook new liberalism. But the point is that there's a very peculiar dichotomy in Keynes and that kind of Keynesianism. That dichotomy says that, look, individual actions certainly together don't add up to full employment and so on. They give rise to involuntary unemployment. But the state then steps in. The state is an embodiment of social rationality. In the Keynesian outlook, or in the outlook of a lot of modern kind of people, the state is an embodiment of social rationality. So you have, on the one hand, a system which, because of the aggregation of individual actions, is irrational. But then you have the state which actually fixes it and makes the system rational. So the lacunae that arise because of individual actions not achieving a rational, socially rational outcome is overcome by the state acting as the embodiment of social rationality. Now this is a very peculiar notion. How can the state act as an embodiment of social rationality, because the state is not outside of society? If you think in terms of the fact that the capitalist system is one in which individuals are compelled to act in particular ways, then that compulsion extends to the state as well. Okay, so the state too is not, as it were, outside of the system that comes in to fix it, but the state too is one which is, the spontaneity of the system incorporates the state as well. Now, that being the case, there are limits to the degree to which the state can intervene. And this is something which has become clearer over time, because for a very long time, after the Second World War, when there was a crisis, the capitalist system emerged much weaker after the Second World War. The old capitalist countries were all kind of devastated. Europe was devastated, and as a result, they were forced to make certain compromises, particularly with social democracy. And one such compromise was the introduction of Keynesian. One compromise, of course, was decolonization, the fact of grant of independence to countries like India and so on. People like Winston Churchill were opposed to it, but they had no option. The other compromise was one man, one vote, the whole kind of electoral democracy. By the way, you'd be surprised to know that the country of the country of the most famous bourgeois revolution, France, had one person, one vote being introduced only in 1945. That's just 7 years before it happened in India. So 1945 is when France had universal adult suffrage. And that is again something which was really one of the compromises which was arrived at. in a period when capitalism was very weak. But on the other hand, you had the third kind of compromise, namely state intervention in demand management to maintain near full employment, and in Europe through welfare state measures. As a matter of fact, everybody believed that capitalism had changed because of these post war adjustments it had to make for its own survival. As a matter of fact, there was a very well known book which, when I was an undergraduate student, was very popular. It was a book called Has Capitalism Changed? It had a lot of very well known writers, John Kenneth Galbraith, Paul Sweezy, Shigeto Suru, and so on. And the general conclusion was that yes, it has changed. But as a matter of fact, once you see capitalism as a spontaneous system, the spontaneous system may in fact receive a set, its tendencies may not manifest themselves for some time, but on the other hand, over a period of time, the spontaneity reasserts itself, which is exactly what has happened, because the high levels of employment generated under post-war capitalism, something which is referred to as the golden age of capitalism, meant that the reserve army of labor was more or less exhausted. The exhaustion of the reserve army of labor basically the exhaustion of the reserve army of labor basically meant that you had an inflationary upsurge, because with the not elimination, but with the substantial reduction in unemployment, workers started bargaining for higher money wages, and when they bargained for higher money wages, prices got pushed up, and therefore you actually had a situation of an inflationary upsurge. Meanwhile, centralization of capital had meant huge amounts of money capital being put together in European banks and so on, and these enormous kind of globules of finance were really getting eroded through inflation, because inflation was reducing the real value of these enormous concentrations of money capital. Therefore, the centralization of capital actually forced governments to take steps to reduce the rate of inflation, and the typical steps you can take under capitalism to reduce inflation is to generate unemployment. Margaret Thatcher generated 3 million unemployed in Britain in order to break the inflationary upsurge which had taken place. So once more, the spontaneity of capitalism asserted itself. Therefore, individual freedom is completely incompatible with capitalism, where individuals, as I said, lack agency. They appear to be acting in ways, but on the other hand, those ways are dictated to them by the functioning of the system itself. Now, that being the case, individual freedom is something which really requires going beyond capitalism. I believe, obviously going beyond capitalism, and therefore having a system where individuals cooperate in ways where they are not coerced into acting, but cooperate in order to act in particular ways, in order to act according to their individual volition. But of course, the individual volition then has to be tempered by the fact that they are members of a community, they're members of a collective. So the recreation of a community, which begins, of course, with the formation of trade unions. Marx has a wonderful passage in Poverty of Philosophy where he says that the trade unions are formed in order to improve the wages of the workers. But you find over time trade unions don't improve anybody's wages because they're not strong enough. But the workers, even out of their meager wages, really contribute substantial amounts to keep the union going, because the importance of the collective has then overtaken the fact that you want higher wages. And therefore, many of you who may be mathematical economists, you think in terms of trade unions and so on, in terms of or combinations, what Marx called combinations, as coalitions. They're not coalitions. A coalition implies that each individual is joining it just to promote his or her own individual interest. But the whole point about a combination is that you transcend your individual interest. Okay, so uh, the, therefore, but they are embryonic forms in which people come together. But ultimately, therefore, individual freedom can be achieved only under a system that is not a spontaneous system. And socialism is, in fact, such a system in which people own the means of production together cooperatively. And this really makes socialism into, I mean, in my perception, therefore, the socialist project is actually a freedom project. You see, normally socialism is presented in terms of, forces of production, relations of production, and so on. That really, socialism is presented in terms of the fact that capitalism at some stage acts as a fetter on the development of productive forces. Therefore, socialism is presented as superior to capitalism in terms of production, while I'm actually trying to shift the focus. Not that the focus is not there in Marx, but on the other hand, I'm trying to highlight, prioritize the focus on the fact that socialism is essentially a project of freedom, of wanting freedom, including individual freedom. Now, this is something which, of course, would mean that there may be many situations in which the development of the productive forces might actually come into conflict with individual freedom. But on the other hand, in all such cases, I believe freedom has priority as opposed to the development of productive forces. I mean, one very obvious example is this whole business about land being snatched from peasants in order to set up factories. Factories are supposed to be for the development of the productive forces, but on the other hand, this basically dispossesses the workers. It's against the will of of the peasants. Now, anything which is against the will of the peasants but promotes the development of productive forces is something that I would look upon with kind of questioning, while that is something that traditional defense of socialism would have said very good, it's important for the development of productive forces. The fact that there is this contradiction, or I wouldn't say contradiction, this duality of perspective is something which those of you who may be interested, in in the Soviet Union in the 1920s, there was a proposal. The proposal was that the trade unions should not act as trade unions anymore, that the trade unions should really act as weapons of the socialist state. That after all, the argument was that, look, under capitalism, you require the trade unions to be militant against the kind of, against the factory, whoever was running management of the factory and so on. But under socialism, no, after all, it's a workers' state. So why should the workers' organization be made into an antagonistic body against the management? Rather, the trade union should actually be part of the state machinery. The argument was for militarization of trade unions and so on, against which Lenin wrote a pamphlet which actually, in some sense, brings out some of these problems I'm talking about, called The Trade Union Question and the Mistakes of Trotsky and Bukharin, in which Lenin actually argued that no, it's very important that trade unions must remain as were defenders of workers' rights, even in a socialist state. So the point is that that as I said, the tension between socialism as a freedom project and socialism as a production project is something which is real. But on the other hand, in this, I would put priority on socialism as a freedom project. The last point I want to make is that, if that is true, then how do we, in a socialist society, prevent. Okay, this has many implications. One implication, of course, is that the socialist society must be a decentralized society. Okay, this would also mean that central planning, which was always associated with socialism, is something which, after all, treats the individuals as cogs. That if you have a central plan, and if that central plan is going to be implemented, then everybody must conform to it, in which case, in a very different sense, the individual gets alienated, because the individual is then directed to act again as a cog in the central plan. What is this? Then it means that economic decisions have to be taken by the people themselves, and that is something which is possible only if you have a very decentralized system. Like, for instance, in China, you had for a very long time communes, in which the commune was the center of where decisions were taken, and meeting of the commune would take those decisions, etc. The other thing is that even so, it is quite possible for the collective to actually ride roughshod over individual rights and so on. That it is possible for the collective to actually reduce the individual to a cipher, and that has to be prevented. And I believe that can be prevented even in a socialist society by having a set of fundamental economic rights that every individual must have. I believe we should fight for fundamental economic rights in our own society, even though it's not a socialist one. But on the other hand, certainly a socialist society must have fundamental economic rights, like right to employment, like right to food, right to free education. It's true that socialist societies may automatically give this, but this must be enshrined as a right which prevents any kind of deviation from it. So, I request you to have a look at the book, but the idea is to really provide a certain vision of socialism that goes beyond I think socialism made enormous achievements in the defeated fascism. It actually introduced the most gigantic welfare state the world has ever seen. It helped in decolonization of countries like India. But on the other hand, obviously, it was also associated with a certain amount of authoritarianism and so on, which one-party dictatorship and so on, none of which is really conducive, if you like, to individual freedom, because in some sense, while you may overcome the alienation of the individual under capitalism, that individual becomes subject to another kind of becomes a cog in another system, and this is something which, in my view, is incompatible with socialism, and therefore we should visualize socialism as one in which individuals express themselves and have the right to express themselves, and therefore have a system in which all kinds of alienation are overcome, whether it's political alienation owing to one-party dictatorship, or whether it's economic alienation owing to the impersonality of the capitalist system. Thank you.
Thank you.